Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. In this video, we're going to look at a deceptively simple question, usually framed as whether you should switch with all villagers immediately to boar when it's lured in, or if you should finish any sheep that have already been killed first. This can either be due to unfortunate timing of the boar while a sheep still has lots of food left on it, or possibly a rogue villager takes an extra sheep in the scuffle when you're focusing on the boar. Of course, the question can then easily be expanded to include deer or any combination of those three, including their variants. There's a few schools of thought on this question, but at its core, there's an interesting math problem. So how could I resist? In theory, one principle is to have as few decaying animals as possible at once, the implication then being to finish whichever animal has the least food remaining. That's a sensible rule, but is complicated by the fact that villagers collect at different rates from different animals, with boar and deer being collected about 25% faster than sheep. Animals themselves also decay at different speeds, with boar, for example, decaying almost twice as fast as sheep or deer. So one could argue you should focus down the fastest decaying animal first. Any model here is going to have to take all of this into account. Now, I'm going to assume for this you have 8 villagers, as usually you start with 6 on sheep, then after a few on wood, have a 7th villager lure boar, with at least one more going to the boar right away. So it's a common number for when this question comes up. To start things off, let's say you have a freshly killed sheep and a boar you just lured, and are trying to decide which to handle first. Now, I won't go into the details of the calculation, which I did via spreadsheet, but you're free to pause and double check it. The takeaway is simply that if you focus all 8 villagers on the boar, you end with 373 food after the boar and then sheep are used up. Alternately, focusing down the sheep first leaves you with 382 food. That's 9 extra food, so there's a good argument here to finish the sheep first. But there's a twist. If we actually calculate the rate that the food is coming in both cases, going with the boar first, you end up collecting a little faster, since you're spending more time focused on the faster food source. This is the trade-off. Do you prefer slightly faster collection or more food in total? Obviously, these are relatively small amounts either way that won't win or lose the game, but means the optimal path is a bit situation dependent, and whether your main goal is to advance as quickly as possible on a tight build order, in which case focusing the boar looks better, or extract the most value from your free food sources, say in a fast castle, in which case focusing down the sheep looks like the better choice. Now, I should point out the sheep's starting food changes things slightly, though perhaps not how most players would expect. If the sheep had 50 food left on it instead of 100, rather than make it less important, the difference is actually enhanced, with a greater speed advantage to picking the boar first, and an even larger gap percentage-wise of food collected by taking the sheep first. Basically, within reason, the more you've chipped away at the sheep already, the more incentive you have to just finish it off first, if you want to maximize total food. If that sounds odd, think about it this way. The sheep is going to lose about 25 food to decay while you take from the boar. If you abandon the sheep with around that much left, you're basically giving up all the food left on the sheep. If you power through the sheep though, you get everything it's offering. Plus, it'll be quick enough that you'll only lose 4 or 5 food off the boar in that short period of time. If that still doesn't make sense, then just trust me bro, I did the math. In case you're curious, if we had a water buffalo instead of a sheep with 150 food, then there's actually less difference between the two choices. If we're talking about an elephant though instead of a boar, then the difference is exaggerated a bit more. And the general pattern is the larger the gap in food remaining between two animals, the better it is to quickly finish off the one with less food. Now, of course, it's always a good idea to confirm these things practically, and doing a scenario editor test, I did indeed find that going with sheep first led to more food overall, but the average collection rate was a tiny bit slower as expected. And notice the gather rates were all lower than the theoretical values because of the usual walking and bumping around. An obvious follow-up question then is whether there might be a sweet spot with splitting between the two and not totally focusing down one or the other first. If you watch any good player, they often have some degree of splitting between food sources once they have 8 or more villagers under the town center. And the reality is having all of your villagers go from one animal to another leads to a lot of transitions and all the bumping that comes with that. To that point, splitting 4 and 4, or even 6 on boar and 2 on sheep, I noticed a slight uptick in collection rate compared to putting all of them on boar first as a group. I think it's pretty intuitive that splitting villagers into groups of 6 or less is going to lead to the fewest pathing issues. In reality, rather than be quite as extreme as the theoretical math is modeling, with all villagers jumping from one animal to the other, I think a more practical application of the principles here would be within that natural splitting you're going to do anyway, on which animal are you going to place more of your emphasis. Of course, the trade-off with splitting villagers is that it's terrible from the viewpoint of decay. Thinking about it, the worst situation would be to split villagers so the boar and sheep wrap up at the exact same time, which is pretty much what happens if you put 2 villagers on sheep and 6 on a fresh boar. We can even graph how much total food is lost to rotting away, where here the x-axis represents the number of villagers being put onto sheep with the rest of the 8 on boar. And notice that splitting with 2 villagers on sheep gives the most decay. While we're on the topic of small wrinkles here though, naturally I started to wonder if civilization had any impact on this, and it turns out it does. For Mongols, with their 40% faster hunters, they finish the boar quickly enough that they get basically the same total food either way, and emphasizing the boar with more villagers leads to a faster collection rate. So for them, focusing on the boar gives all of the upside without any downside. On the flip side, for Britons, with their shepherd bonus, focusing more on sheep first leads to not only more food, but the same collection rate as boar, meaning it's just strictly better to finish any killed sheep first. Basically, if you have a civ bonus, then lean into it. So those are the main questions I wanted to look at, but while we're at it, what about deer? This is actually a much simpler case, as villagers collect from both deer and boar at the same rate, so this purely comes down to decay. And as you should expect, you end with the most food by finishing the deer as quickly as possible. Again, this is even more true if the deer has been partially gathered from already, getting almost 6% more in total if the deer has just 30 food left when the boar arrives. Again, that may be counterintuitive, as a deer with only 30 or 40 food left might seem less important to finish. But again, you're basically discarding all of the deer's remaining food by leaving it at that point. Instead, by powering through the last bit of deer first, you still have the opportunity to capture the vast majority of the boar's food and end in a slightly better position than you otherwise would be. But what about deer and sheep? Say you have some sheep on the go and push in a new deer. Theoretically, there might be some issues with force dropping off, but putting that aside, which one makes more sense to emphasize with extra villagers? It turns out there's almost no difference, even compared to the already pretty modest differences we've seen. Going with deer first leads to a slightly higher collection rate, while focusing on the sheep gives a tiny bit more food. This flips, however, if we're talking about a freshly killed water buffalo with 150 food. And in that case, all else being equal, you should prioritize the deer more, as it's faster to collect. So you get the food faster and a bit more in total, since you get down to 1 decaying animal the tiniest bit sooner. Again, the most important idea is that unnecessary splitting, say 2 villagers split between 2 deer, is probably the main thing to avoid, as you just prolong the time you have all animals decaying. These aren't catastrophic mistakes, mind you, but is technically what the math says. Of course, stepping away from the theory, splitting between the two boosted the collection rate in a practical test by a little over 2% at the cost of a bit of food, which may be something you intentionally decide you prefer. But now let's take things to one final level. What if by some strange coincidence you have all 3 under your town at once, and 8 villagers? Of these 6 possible orders, what is the optimal way to handle this? Obviously, you could split your villagers up, but I think you know by now that is not going to be the theoretically optimal play. I'd encourage you to take a guess before I tell you, using the principles we've covered to see if you can work out the best order to maximize your total food and the best order to maximize collection rate. If you have your guesses ready, let's see the results. The fastest way to get food is pretty obviously to go for the boar, or probably splitting between the boar and deer, as that cuts down on walking and prioritizes the fastest food sources. To get the most food though, it actually doesn't really matter if you take the deer or sheep first, but the boar should definitely be last if you want to maximize total food. In case you're curious, the absolute worst thing you could do from a total food perspective is 4 on the boar, 2 on deer, and 2 on the sheep, coming out with 466 food versus 490 by doing it in a more optimized order, which is the difference of about 5% less food. What's funny though is splitting ended up being at least 2% faster than any other method. And at least with 8 villagers or more, there's clearly a small advantage to splitting villagers to some degree. Again, I can't emphasize enough though, everything here is just general principles with very small effect sizes. This is mostly just for interest's sake, but hopefully you picked up something useful to keep in mind during your next Dark Age. That'll do it for this one though. Huge thanks to Seb, GS Jasper, James, Jared2142, Jockster, Justin, Kyle, Samantha, Steven, Woodruff, and everyone else on Patreon for their amazing support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.